It's heartwarming to see so many faces of our longtime members and friends, as well as some who have come here a few times, or maybe this is your first time. All are welcome in this space. As I've said previously, David and I initially came here for the Sunday school program, and I feel that I've grown personally from being in this community. I've described our group as like-minded people, but that's not really true. We are not homogeneous. We don't always think alike. We are interested in bettering the world, and when we don't agree, we're interested in hearing other voices and aim for reaching an agreement. Are we perfect? No. Are there arguments? Sometimes. Could we be better? Yes. I feel that our community wants to have better interpersonal relationships, and that makes me stop and think and proceed slower. And I think that makes my interactions with people better. All right, this morning, Curt will be speaking to us. Curt Collier is the interim leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County. Curt has a wealth of knowledge of ethical culture, having previously served 18 years as a leader for 3 other societies, New York, Riverdale Yonkers, and St. Louis. During those 18 years, he was involved in all aspects of congregational life. Some highlights include running monthly workshops on ethical economics, sustainable living, and ethical actions while at the New York Society. While in Riverdale Yonkers, he created and fostered alliances with local groups to use the society and promote their activities, including founding a homeless shelter at the society and founding Just Matrimony, a push for gay marriage rights within societies of the Ethical Union. He completed his internship with the St. Louis Society. Curt is also the National Youth Programs Director for Groundwork USA, an environmental nonprofit created by the National Park Service and Environmental Protection Agency, and oversees youth development and career programs in 20 states. Curt has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Texas A&M University, a master's degree in communication disorders from Texas Tech University, certification in counseling from the Postgraduate Center for Mental Health in New York, and has completed coursework for a doctoral degree in pastoral counseling from Hebrew Union College. Curt is a single father, and at least until the pandemic is over, lives in Norfolk, Virginia, and various hotel rooms and major highways in the United States. Let's see, Curt's topic this morning is how race impacts conservation. And I now give you Curt.
Good morning, everyone. And I have to tell you what a pleasure it was yesterday. I got home to Norfolk at midnight last night. I had to go back to the hotel and pick up my travel trailer. I have a big giant tool trailer, so you saw my truck loaded down. But Lisa and Samantha and Diane and everybody who made all that possible yesterday, what a great way to meet all of you. And let's do that again. I know that was a lot of work, but we got to do that. I think it was just so much fun. And I'm a big fan of parks, so and I'm all for, we should just meet there every Sunday. So hopefully that day will come and we'll in person to one again and can be more fun. I wanted to start off by saying something to Susan. Susan has been an extremely remarkable person to work with since I've come in March. I know that you've appointed her as her leader, and she served the first year, second year, third year, and then fourth year. Pandemic was hard on all of us, and this is a woman who is sitting on phone trying to help young kids with speech and hearing disorders and learning and cognitive development things, and trying her best through this to connect with youth. And I have to tell you what an emotionally difficult job. I share in that field, and I just can't imagine doing that. And Susan, you pulled through it. You showed up for this community, and you've been pretty remarkable. And I'm going to miss having you doing your opening words because I really appreciate it. And I kind of want to leave you with the words from Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who asked the question, what is success? And he says, to laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate the beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to know even one life has breathed easier because you has lived. This is to have succeeded. And so thank you, Susan, for all your leadership over these last 4 years and for helping me adjust. And I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
I, like many of you, am somewhat bewildered over conversations about race in the United States recently. And it's not just because I understand these are sensitive political issues, and we've had so many difficulties dealing with policing in the United States and figuring out justice around that, and also all of the things that we know that impact race in America. I'm more frightened by the fact that we're now being told we can't even have conversations around that. In so many places, they're banning any kind of race discussion. I remember that when Donald Trump put out an executive order that you could no longer do diversity training within the government or with any of the organizations. And as an organization that works for racial equity in environmental challenges, of course, we knew that that was a direct threat, not only to the people who work for the government, but for others of us as well. And so I've been thinking a lot about these things and trying to ask the question. I too remember hearing Biden stand there on the stage and say that this is not a racist country, but also knowing everything that we know about the history of the United States and all the things that we have been talking about. As Susan mentioned, I'm not only an ethical culture leader, but I use my environmental work as part of my ethical culture work, which is going out there and building healthy places for people, redeeming and revitalizing neighborhoods, using them as places where people can get an economic foothold and to move on like that. And that's the work I've been doing also while I was in ethical culture for 15 years. So not only have I served as an ethical culture leader, but for many portions of that have worked actually as an environmentalist. And so the recent conversations have given me an opportunity to think about to what extent does conversations or lack thereof impact something like the work I do in environmental science and environmental careers. And I just want to kind of give you some my take on that, about the complexity of these things and why I think banning discussions on race is a great disservice. I am an environmentalist, as I said, and I have to tell you, I'm extremely happy with the Biden administration's recent rollout, that the fact that several millions of dollars will be heading to conservation corps across the United States. I say that because I also manage several hundred young adults at national parks across the United States. I'm just came from Paterson, New Jersey, running a corps with youth there. I'll be heading to Sandy Hook and running corps down there. If you want to come down to the beach and see me with a bunch of young adults, teaching them construction, which is what I do, and building those things. Then I'm heading to Glacier National Park and restoring the artist cabin up there with young adults, and then down to Yellowstone for an entire month. And people say, how can you live in a tent for so long and do that? And it's just a joy. It really is a joy. And so part of me is very, very excited by the fact that we're going to be having all these new kinds of funds, that part of what we need to do is to create what are called climate resiliency corps across the United States. We need to tackle climate change, as I'm sure Janet Glass could give an entire lecture on. We need to tackle climate resiliency. We need to address all these things. And I'm extremely happy that the funding is going through. I'm happy that we've had a chance to work with Senator Markey and Senator Whitehouse and some other people in Congress who are trying to move these things forward and have used groundwork as a model. Actually, the youth program that I helped create and basically run across the United States have used that as a model for what we should be doing in other parts of the United States. So to a certain extent, I have to tell you that indeed I am very hopeful. But in my fear is that in the long term, this funding will not work. It will not work just like it did with the WPA, with the Civilian Conservation Corps, with the Youth Conservation Corps, with AmeriCorps, and all the other kinds of projects and environmental teams that we have run across the United States. Now, let me talk about what I mean by success and failure. Certainly, it's going to get tens of thousands of young adults out there working. It's going to do much needed work on federal lands. It's going to help us deal with the storm impacts that we have on our coastal shores. It's going to deal with the work that needs to be done within our national parks, things like that. But unless we have a conversation about race, then we're not going to change the biggest thing, which is the face of conservation in America. And that's extremely important that we do that, because conservation in America currently does not reflect the diversity of the country by any means. And so as the United States grows and becomes more racially diverse, and yet we see less and less people of color in conservation, this should be a warning sign that something is wrong. Something is not moving forward. Certainly, we know it has nothing to do with the people of color. It perhaps has to do with something with the way that we're structuring these things and making it much more difficult for people to get involved. But the problem is that now that when we be having these conversations about why the WPA and the CCC, which were so successful in building national parks and creating the Blue Ridge Parkway and all of these facilities, why they weren't successful though in helping to change the face of conservation in America. So we had all these programs and they were highly successful to an extent, but they also did not, any of them really change the face of conservation significantly. And so we're here now, and not only can we not talk about what that is, but that's getting more and more difficult. You know, you're all probably familiar with the 1619 project from the New York Times. 1619 was the date of the first enslaved person brought to these shores. And it was actually to talk about how the first 300 years of our history, should we say the white people's history on the American shores was benefited and was impacted because of slavery. And of course, that upsets a lot of people, and they don't want to have that conversation, or they think it's negative. And bills saying that these are divisive concepts, that when we talk these things about race in America, that they're divisive concepts, and that this training should be forbidden in lots of different places. And of course, even Trump said we couldn't even talk about diversity training, which I mentioned before. And currently 12 states have laws on the books banning teaching about race. Now 12 states are in Bill's legislature are no longer allowed to talk about race or talk about the impact of race on that. And I think that's a mistake for some of the reasons that I'll mention here for a second. You know, back in the 1950s, it was the communist Red Scare, which is one of the things that allowed conservatives to rally against liberals and suppress the liberal vote. Now it's called critical race theory. They're throwing this term out as if discussing this Marxist literature that they're talking about is somehow going to take away from the fabric of America, despite the fact that critical race theory is no more different than any other kinds of political discourse that we have in the United States. But that term, critical race theory, is one of the things that people say, well, this is even a religion, and that we're teaching a religion that teaches hatred towards other races, which is absolutely not true. One of the things that critical race theory talks about is that when people get into power, regardless of who those people are, if they are a majority, that they create institutions and processes to keep themselves in power. That could be overt, it's often covert, or sometimes it's It's just the way the structure gets built. That you create a system. If you have a whole bunch of people with left-handed, and you're probably going to have automobile designs that are far different than the ones we have in the US today. It just how any group of people who come into power and become the majority, how they impact those things. And so critical race theory says, to what extent has the fact that the US is a predominantly white country originally, we've got to remember we displaced all the people who were here originally and replaced them with white people from across the United States. And when the white people became into power, we just need to talk about that. They did put together all kinds of institutions, including slavery in the South and in other states in Southwest, Texas, and other places that kept the balance of power firmly into their hands, and that continued on and on. So let me just give an example of that, why not talking about race is so difficult for the work that I do. As Susan mentioned, I am the National Youth Program Director for Groundwork USA. So Groundwork was created by the National Park Service and the EPA to go into dense urban areas heavily impacted by pollution, previously industrial areas that have now deindustrialized, left a large amount of toxic waste behind that causes the disinvestment into that area. So for example, a lot of times people look at places like Hackensack or Yonkers, New York, or areas all across the New York regions and say, why don't they fix up this town? Why are there so many derelict buildings? Why don't they just come in here and make things better? And the challenge is that is something related to something like Love Canal. If you remember that story, Love Canal in upstate New York near Niagara Falls had a piece of land. There was a chemical factory plant there. When the chemical factory closed, the city wanted that land because of its proximity to some prime real estate areas. The chemical plant said, I don't think you should build on here. The city said, that's okay, we're going to do it anyway. The chemical plant wasn't quite honest about all the stuff that got dumped there. They then built an entire housing complex on top of the land. And then this baby got sick. This baby was born deformed. These people got leukemia. These people got cancer. And it happened again and again and again until somebody looked at the records and found that the land was highly polluted. So we passed laws in the United States saying that you cannot redevelop land unless you do what are called case studies on that land and you look at it, what we call phase 1 and phase 2 testing to see what's in the soil. You don't want to build your new home on or move into an apartment complex that was used to be a chemical waste dump. The problem is that all across the United States, lots of places, especially in the industrial Northeast, are chemically polluted areas. They took all those chemicals and dumped them into the ground. People in Yonkers told me that they used to tell what color they were painting cars at the plant upstream, because when they got done with the paint, they would just dump it into the river and color the river as it flowed past the Hudson River as it flowed past New York City. And of course, you all know the story of the Anaconda Wire Company dumping all kinds of PCBs in the river and all the types of pollutions. So we passed laws, and the law says you can't do anything unless you clean up the land. The problem is what do you do with that polluted pieces of soil? Nobody's going to want to take something. It didn't end up in landfill. The city of Philadelphia, for example, wanted to put in new fresh soil in all of its parks. This is in Philadelphia. They hired a company. This company came in and covered all the parks in Philadelphia with new clean soil to make sure that they were covering over the lead, only to find out that the soil had actually been moved around by the mob, and it was far more toxic, the soil that got dumped on hundreds of parklands in Philadelphia. And this happened again and again. You couldn't do anything with a piece of land unless you remediated the soil. Nobody wanted the soil. People said, why am I paying taxes on pieces of land if I cannot remediate them? And so they all just started walking away from them. That left these pieces of land to be used by nefarious activities. They became economic drags on the community. And then more and more people just came into the area and dumped building debris and illegal dumping on those places. Happened all over the Northeast. So people say, why don't you clean up that land? The land you're looking at is probably toxic. And they haven't found a way to deal with that because people don't have the money to deal with it. So that's the kind of the work that I'm doing in trying to get other people to handle and to deal with this. So the problem is as a national youth program director, I'm finding a way, or I was challenged with how do we get the next group, the next generation of stewards interested in this work. As you can imagine, this is very technical work. It takes 10 years to get something done. You have to have people there the entire time going on, and then yet you're still trying to do this. However, these areas were not just impacted by illegal dumping and by post-industrial. That's one of the things that happened. The other thing that happened is in the 30s and 40s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation decided that they wanted to provide loans to returning servicemen, and so that we could actually build new homes across the United States. The HOLC hired private contractors who were supposed to go into various areas of the cities and determine which areas were good for putting new homes and opening those up for new development, and which areas were to be avoided. Most of these private contractors just went into the areas, found out where their people of color were listed, and then rated them as Class D on the lowest scale, what we called redlining, which I'm sure most of you haven't. People who were in red line districts could not get these new loans to redevelop their lands. People of color could not move into white areas because they were afraid if people of color moved into white areas, that it would cause property values to drop and disinvestment and all those things that happen because of white flight. And now we have the conditions around the United States where 64% of those original homeowner land corporation pieces of land, those red lined areas, are some of the most unsafe places for climate. As you know, the most deadly impact we have in the United States because of climate is not hurricanes, it's not tornadoes, it's heat. Think about it yesterday. Here it is June 1st, and it was in the 90s in that area. And plus you got high humidity. Now you all know, because many of you are urban dwellers, what that is like in a city where there's lots of concrete, where there are buildings with not adequate air conditioning, where there's lack of greening, where there's no urban canopy. And in our study, we looked at all the places that were redlined, and that's what we see. There are no parks there. There's lack of greenery. There's no urban canopy. And so that heat island effect, the thing that kills the most Americans in the United States, not hurricanes, not tornadoes, not fires, but heat impacts, of course, was impacted because of redlining, which is impacting from because of race. This is also where I came in. I was hired in Yonkers, New York. This is the work that I was doing. In the 1980s, because of the changes that were going on in all across the United States, but especially in dense urban areas, in 1980s, the federal government said that Yonkers had to desegregate its public housing in Yonkers, starting in 1980, so not that long ago. Because of that, the city of Yonkers then defied them and took it to 7 years of court cases to try and stop them. They finally got all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says not only do you have to desegregate the housing in Yonkers, but you also have to desegregate the schools. In 1987, they were still not doing that. In 1988, Yonkers was fined $1 million a day by the Supreme Court, $1 million a day, in order to force the city to desegregate its public housing and to open up to those areas. As you can imagine that, you would think the city would have said no, but they went actually 15 more days. This drug on and on. They laid off and fired 500 city employees. They no longer picked up waste. They no longer had garbage. Everything, the garbage piled up. They would already do that and pay $1 million a day rather than desegregate those houses. When they finally did, as it happens in many places that cannot cross the United States, some more than areas, there was a large amount of what we call white flight. People left the area, they disinvested. This was a heavily industrialized city. Yonkers is where the Otis elevator factory was located. This is where plastics was invented, is Yonkers, New York. That's where FM radio was invented. In fact, you can see the radio tower on the Palisades if you drive up the Palisade Parkway. And so the city not only lost a lot of money, it bankrupted the city. There was a large amounts of industrial waste that was already there, large amounts of disinvestment, and then it went down from there. That's when I came in the door now in the 15 years ago. The question is how do you get youth involved in conservation work when there's limited access to nature, which we have a lot of the industrial areas? What nature they see is polluted, and they're told over and over again, don't swim in the rivers, you're going to grow thyroid, don't sit on the ground, it's got arsenic, and it's got cadmium, it's got lead in there. What does that impact have on youth if you do those things? We know that many of our early experiences with nature determine our feelings towards the environment. That's what the research says. And if children don't trust nature early on, that's going to carry with them into adulthood. And that the majority of people of color actually live near areas that are heavily polluted pieces of land. In fact, when we did research across the United States, where do you think the waste treatment plants were put? Where do you think the burning of the trash was put? Where do you think chemicals were dumped? They were often done as through environmental injustice areas where these things can happen. One of the first things I was asked to do then was to create a project where I would take the youth around town. I had this little computer, handheld computer, and we would map the problems with the city. So we would look for burnt out houses. We would look up empty or vacant properties. We look at lack of curb cuts, so people in wheelchairs could not get around. We look for things like a lack of a place for people to sit waiting for the bus out of the elements, especially in the winter. And I would do this by taking large photographs my company created of kind of streets that needed help. And they've trained me to show these to the youth and have them look at the pictures and say, okay, what would you want to fix here? As you can imagine, when I took these large photographs and put them in the back of the wall and showed all the youth and brought all my equipment, I said, okay, now tell me what you see in this area that should be fixed. And the youth all looked at those great big pictures of their, vacant buildings, burnt out cars, and large amount of graffiti and no curb cuts and all these things, and said, and no street canopy. I said, no, that looks pretty good to me. I remember one kid saying, yeah, my uncle lives on that street. And then I went, holy crap. How can you tell somebody to see something which is what you've always seen? And one of the challenges we have is not only is there lack of access to nature and lack of clean places that they can go and parks to get around them, but if a youth has just grown up with these things all their lives, that's what they see. Now, the solution for a lot of people is what's called nature tourism. Let's put all the youth in buses and take them out someplace, have them look at, take them in air-conditioned buses and get them off in a park and let them swat flies for a while, have lunch, get back on the bus, go back in. I knew that wouldn't work. In fact, I'm pretty against nature tourism, which is what I call it. I believe more in sweat equity, that you get people to fall in love with the land by sinking their hands into the soil. That's the kind of connections that most people need, because you can't have a relationship with something like nature. You can't have a relationship unless you've worked with it, just like in your own relationships with your own family. Now, the second challenge I had was not only did they have not access to nature, and the nature they did was polluted, and they had no good examples of what greening would look like. And because the disinvestment had happened, there was no urban canopies and no of these other things. The other problem I had is that when I did introduce the youth to careers and thinking about conservation work and the things they do, all of the people who they met in those fields were not reflective of their diversity. Now, that's important. When you go to work in an area, you want to see people who are like you there and who are interested into that. When I first started, the National Park Service had 2.5% of their employees were African-American males. 2.5%, and that was the largest ethnic group at the time, 2.5%. So most people, when they encounter a park ranger, they look a lot like me, older white males across the United States. And in fact, if you look at the physical sciences and all the universities and all of the forestry programs and all of the kind of geography and geology programs, only 11% of the total faculty are people of color, are Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Pacific Islanders, only 11%. So if people were to go into conservation youth, and I finally did get them interested and they went to go work with people in those things, they would find that the majority of people there don't even look like them. And that is, believe it or not, a problem. Dorcetta Taylor, who is herself from Jamaica originally and now a doctor of environmental science, said that when she did a survey of conservation programs across the United States, only 12% of the people in power in conservation programs are people of color. That's including Hispanics, Blacks, Asian Pacifics. Only 12% of the people in conservation programs are people of color. If you've ever seen Sierra Club meetings, or you go to some of these other great organizations, which are fantastic works, the Nature Conservancy and other, they tend to look a lot like us. And the question is why is that so? Why does conservation look so different? We know it's not because people of color don't appreciate parks. In fact, the largest group of people to pay for parks and to push through for bills for park development are Blacks. Blacks and African Americans are the people who are more likely to vote for parks in an area. You know, there was a park ranger named Sheldon Johnson, who himself is Black, went on Oprah Winfrey show, and he was trying to talk with her about encouraging more people of color to go camping. And in that famous video, which you can see online, Oprah Winfrey said, "We don't do this," which means Black people don't do this. Now, that's not true. We know that Blacks do support parks. We know that people, Hispanics, support parks. If you go to any park on a weekend, in fact, when we were there yesterday, I pay attention to these things. Majority of the people there at that park were people of color. And we also know that they're more likely to support parks. So why was Oprah Winfrey and Sheldon Johnson, who was trying to change that, saying, "We don't do this"? A good example of that is if you think of Yosemite National Park, which is near Oakland, only a couple of hours from Oakland, California, which is a predominantly person of color park. And yet, if you take Yosemite National Park, 2% of the people of color are in the backcountry. Now, the people do come into the park, but if you say, why don't they go into the backcountry? I mean, why aren't they hiking up the hills and going into the backcountry? And Sheldon Johnson pointed out to something that I've heard from people of color over and over again. I'll never forget, I went to an Appalachian Trail Conservancy conference, and there were these two older Black gentlemen, and they asked the audience about their great American road trip adventures that we had all had. My family did the same thing. I was in South Texas, and my parents drove us to Glacier National Park. The first seems like 5 months was just driving out of the state of Texas, because I can't remember saying to my father, "Are we out of Texas yet?" Just went on and on and on. But we did that great trip up to Glacier and down to Yellowstone and all of these great things. I told people the other day that when I asked my father when I was a kid what religion we were, he said, "We're campers," because that's what we did on Sundays. And so these two gentlemen who were at this workshop at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy were trying to get everybody to tell these stories, and everybody was chiming in. And then these two men said, "Let me just tell you a little bit about our experiences. First of all, if you went hiking in the backcountry, you could get arrested for vagrancies. If you traveled across the United States, you had to find a place to get to park. A lot of places were discriminating against you getting in hotels. When you finally did get to the parks, there were racially segregated campgrounds. And the United States did a very good job. The National Park Service did a very good job about trying to push against that. But in the South, it was almost impossible to do. And many of those places that there was not even a place to go. You got to also remember that between 1865 and 1968, there were 6,500 victims of racial hatred, including the lynching of 3,446 Black people in the United States. That's just the documented numbers. They suspect that the number is higher than that. People didn't go into the woods because the woods were scary. And it wasn't scary because there were bears there. It was scary because there were people that looked like me there who didn't want people of color there. And that's why they didn't go camping, because they didn't feel safe going out into places outside the cities that they couldn't get to, that if they thought their car broke down, they couldn't get their car repaired, and they weren't going to do that kind of thing. Now, the second challenge is if you talk to our youth and they say, yeah, we don't go camping, our parents don't go camping, and we've never done that, and I have to get them to do that in order to think about conservation work and get them out there and thinking about the environment. The other challenges we have is the schools have unequal funding. Now, I know there's a lot of argument about that, saying that's not exactly true, that, since Brown versus the Board of Education, we've gotten rid of these separate but equals. But if you look at the history of that, of unequal funding, it's had long-term consequences. When a lot of these youth's grandparents were young, they couldn't even get accepted to local colleges in many places in the South where they were from. They couldn't apply for local schools. If they went to a career counselor, as we know the research, they were steered away from STEM and science fields because those were basically things that white men went into, and they were pushed into other kinds of fields away from the sciences. Even when we passed the National Education Defense Act, when Sputnik went around the planet, we all freaked out. We passed a law in the United States to raise the math and science of the United States people. Still, people of color who applied for those student loans were shied away from science fields and pushed into other things. The problem is that if you're going to do a conservation workforce and you think of the challenges like polluted pieces of land and dealing with climate change and dealing with energy, things like that, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math matters. And we have to be able to fix those things as well, which we're not doing. And so there is a large number of grandparents who never went into STEM related fields, that led to a large number of parents going in that, and the kids that I saw there today. Now, the problem with that is that if you've underfunded schools, like in Yonkers, that was hit with the $25 million deficit for its education program, they're not bringing in science labs, they're not doing in science training, that when the youth get to college, most of them drop out of science fields. In fact, we'd say that across the United States, over 50% of people of color who come out of urban schools, who end up at universities, take their first chemistry and biology class, find them really hard because their own financial assistance will lose their funding if their GPA falls, they switch majors. It's up to 69% of youth who are in associate fields like technician fields. Now, these are people we want in math and science for a variety of reasons. In fact, Hispanics, by a whopping majority, and Blacks are more likely to believe in climate change than whites are. In fact, 14% of Hispanics don't believe in climate change, only 14%. 23% of Blacks don't believe in climate change, but 33% of whites don't believe in climate change. And so if you ask me who I'd want in there in our conservation and science things, I want to do these things. Now, there are other challenges that we have. I'm trying to build a conservation workforce, and one of the things I want to do is to put tools in youth's hands early on. We know that if youth think of the built environment as malleable, that the buildings are Play-Doh, that we can change them to look at anything any way we want, they're more likely to go into cities, we know for a fact, and want to push for change and to redo things. But in order to have that experience with tools early on, you have to, to have an appreciation for construction, you have to start it very young. In municipal housing in Yonkers, New York, where I worked, people couldn't even paint the color of their walls. When their light bulbs went out, they had to call the super. And how disempowering that is if you can't do any kind of power tools of those do-it-yourself projects that most other people would have gotten involved in. In fact, the laws in the United States that anyone under the age of 18 cannot use power tools, which is an important part of the work that we do, which is in carpentry and construction and rebuilding this new America that we're hoping to do and rebuilding the green infrastructure. To do that, you need to know how to use power tools. And yet majority of the law says that anyone 18 years or younger for safety reasons can't even use a powered screw gun. Think of that. I got 17-year-old kid in front of me bigger than me, and he says, I kept got to tell him he can't use a little screw gun to put in a screw. And except the law says the only time you can use a power tool is if you live on a farm or your parents own the company. Now let's think about that. The official law in the United States is that youth under the age of 18 cannot use power tools unless you live on a farm and your parents own the company. And we already know that you're going to be at a disadvantage if you're a person of color. We're thinking about American farmers. In the 1920s, there were a million Black farmers in the United States, 1 million in 1920. Today, there are 50,000 Black farmers in the United States. We've lost 36 million acres of farm have been taken away from farmers because they were denied access to loans that white farmers could go. And you think this would still something we could change, we could go out there and support Black farmers. But last year alone, 99% of farm subsidies went to white farmers and not to Black farmers. So they can't use power tools. They're not going camping. They have limited access to people to look at them. They're having limited STEM arrangement. The U.S. Forest Service came to me and said, we like your opinion on something. We know that you talk about these things. We'd like your opinion. We want to make sure we have safe regulations for youth so they can go into the Forest Service lands. You know, we can cut trees and do stuff and do this kind of work. And we're going to create rules that everybody has to have safety training. Now, what's bad about that? I think that's perfectly acceptable. I'm an OSHA instructor myself. I believe safety is important. Until I looked at where the licenses, how you had to do them, where you went to go find these licenses and what were going on. First of all, the licenses to be able to go onto the U.S. Forest Service land and use cutting tools required multiple hours of unpaid training, which means you had to go for 700 hours unpaid training to get all the licenses you needed to do in order to work on U.S. Forest Service land. Most of these training centers were places far from the urban centers, and they were located in places like Arkansas or Tennessee that people of color don't necessarily feel comfortable going to. So they had to go to places to get this training, stay there for months being unpaid, which is difficult if you're at the lower economic scale, and then be denied access. I told the U.S. Forest Service that what they were doing is they were institutionalizing systems that would stop people from color to get involved. And I never heard one single response to my letter to the U.S. Forest Service. Which brings me to the final thing. I'm sorry to drag on, sound too depressing. We're here now, we're talking about Biden administration and this new funding. This new funding is going to be very, very exciting until I look closer to that. And I sit on several national committees to help explain what's going to happen. Most of this money is going to go to AmeriCorps, which means you're going to have to be over the age of 18 or 18 and above to be involved in that. AmeriCorps is not located in the urban areas. When I was visiting y'all 2 weeks ago, I was staying at a hotel in Yonkers where my son's mother lived, and in the hotel was an AmeriCorps. I looked at them, I said, this is great, where are you working? They said they're working in Yonkers. Not one of them was from Yonkers. Not one of them was a person of color in Yonkers, New York. AmeriCorps recruits kids from across the United States who are not located in communities. They're not locally hired. It puts them into places where they have no connections to the neighborhoods. We need to understand how important it is to engage local audiences in conservation work. It's the people of color who are living in the most impacted and climate impacted places in the United States. We need them involved in decision making. We need their youth involved. And we certainly can't wait till 18 years of age before we involve the youth into climate change work. So all of these things in the United States are going to impact. Some of it is about race, some of it's not about race. But if we can't talk about race, we really can't talk about all of the things that impact conservation in America. I'm only representing one field. I bet if we did this conversation with many others on this call, you would all have other things that say, yeah, there are other barriers there that have to be race related. These are complex problems and require complex solutions. but we need the full conversation. You know, I was listening to Jimmy Kimmel one night. He said, white privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It just means the color of your skin isn't one of the things that makes it harder. And I want us to have that conversation. And my fear is that they're going to take that all away from us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Curt. We do have time for some questions this morning. I'm going to actually take my privilege to ask the first question this morning. Curt, thank you, first of all, for that very impassioned and personal, I think, involvement in this issue. I know that Detroit is one of those industrial sites that's been ravaged, and a lot of people of color live in those ravaged areas. There's been an effort to have community gardens and urban farming happening to change the environment there. Do you know anything about that? Can you speak a little bit about that?
So we build urban farms. That's one of the projects that we do. And I've built a lot of urban gardens. We manage lots of urban gardens in the United States. And I have USDA grants and have presented similar kind of information to the United States Department of Agriculture about this. Urban gardens are a great way to get started early on. It's a great way for you to get outdoors and work with your parents on planting a little seed in the ground and watching the thing come out, which is the first bit of wonder that we all get when we're kids thinking about conservation. It's especially important in areas where there's not backyards and things like that, where kids can grow vegetables. And some of you, for urban dwellers, you've always lived in apartments, you understand that. But these programs and these urban farming is very, very important. The challenge is that we got to make sure that we're getting enough information out there to people to be able to do that. There's a difference between gardening and having it fun and having kids exposure to nature, which I'm all about, and also then being able to produce enough food for you and your family. It takes about 20 acres of land to feed a family of 5, 20 acres of land.
Wow.
Your 4x8 garden plot is not going to do much about that, but it's going to do a lot to help people to learn about food. The conversation I had with the USDA that we not only have to talk about urban gardening, but urban food systems and where our food comes from. 2% of the food that comes into New York City, the tri-state region, 2% is grown in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. 2% of the food that you buy in the local restaurants just comes in from the local area. Most of it is trucked in from other areas far outside, China, Chile. Most of the food you're buying is coming from China and some places like that. Self-determination is agriculture. In 1942, 48% of Americans were involved in agriculture. A few years ago, it's now 1.5%. 1.5% of Americans are involved in agriculture. So I think it's a great thing to do. It's a great business. Urban agriculture in Brooklyn, New York is a $1 billion industry. Think of that, Brooklyn, New York agriculture. That's kale chips and microbrewery and honey and all this kind of stuff that they're good at, but they're involved in food industry. It is something people can make money off of. And the thing I want to do is not only to put that little seed in the ground and watch the wonder of a plant coming up, but to find a way to make a job from it as well.
Thank you. Okay, we have Janet Glass, then Pam, and then Teresa Regaitis.
So Newark is one of the big environmental, justice communities, and something bit of good news, I think. There's a Maria Lopez Nunez, and she has been for 12 years fighting to keep the environmental abuses out of Newark, and her group is mostly people of color and Latinos. So that's very promising. She's involved in an organization called Ironbound Community Corporation, and right now in Newark they're trying to put yet another incinerator plant there. I mean, Newark is just besieged by all sorts of horrible pollutants, and they're trying very hard to fight that incinerator plant. I was wondering if you were familiar with them.
Familiar with it, heard about that. Newark needs to get a hold of some of its other political issues. and some of the corruption that goes on in there as well, which is endemic across many other places in the United States. But I'm very interested in a lot of the things that are going on there in New Jersey because I think they're really important. The problem is that we need a workforce that can deal with conservation. It can deal with complicated pollution issues like cadmium and arsenic in your soil. It can deal with energy and all these things. And the problem is that the industry doesn't exist. So I can train a youth, but once I send them out the door, there's not enough businesses in the United States who are doing this work. So we need funding at the top to make sure that we're at these corporations, that they're being asked to push into conservation related work, and we need places at the bottom. And Newark and those big cities have the money to make that happen. And so I hope that not only are they getting kids out there and doing urban greening and all that stuff, which I think is viable work, but we also need to think about jobs. Conservation in the United States is going to change when there's money there also for people to go into careers and things like that. And those big cities can make that happen. Even TNET can make that happen.
Thank you. Pam Berglund.
Okay, thank you very much. Curt, wonderful talk, because I'm very, very sensitive when it comes to talking about how we're going to change our whole culture of this black and white issue. But I can tell you that we need STEM programs, and we've got to reach out to our politicians, to our congressmen, to the people who can make a difference in the Black communities. And they're not listening. And it's so frustrating that they're not bringing STEM programs to our schools. It's frustrating that our kids don't learn about even workshops or wood shop like what I had when we were in school. So what can we do as part of ethical culture? Can we create more interest by going to our social action committee and getting things done like that?
In the 1990s, we made a big education push in the United States. We looked at the difference and disparities from people who go to college, what they make each year, and the people who are not going to college. And so we said we were going to do away with vocational trainings and encourage everybody to go to college. So we gutted all the vocational programs. Many of us who were younger, you remember there was shop there, and there was HVAC and cosmetology and all those kinds of things. Many of those programs were gutted and everybody was told to go to college. Problem is, not everybody wants to go to college, not everybody needs to go to college, and not everybody can make it in college. And so we were graduating large numbers of people across the United States who are finishing high school with no training, nothing to go into. And it created this gigantic gap. Only recently have we reintroduced STEM training into schools. We have what are called like an IEP, an individualized education plan for each student, that you had to have a career trajectory. And if you don't have an academic, heading to college career, you're supposed to be able to identify what your career is going to be after that. The problem is that many of the STEM programs that we have in college are way underfunded. In order to get a STEM program into college, you have to have someone with a master's degree in that study. So it can't just be someone with a regular degree, you have to have a master's degree. So that requires not only just a regular teacher, but someone who's proficient in that field to teach it. So even I could not go in and teach agriculture, even though I know quite a bit about it and do a lot of work in there, because I don't have a degree in it in that area. So we have to change the laws about these things. We need to change how the funding is, and we need to make them more available. These are simple solutions, you would think, until you realize how funding works in the United States. And if it's not written into law, things just don't get funded. It's not like we can go to a politician and say, hey, I want to put a new playground here. It has to go through all these channels, as you well know, which takes a long period of time.
Thanks very much, Curt. Teresa Regaitis, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, I teach environmental science, and I have to say that I have the kids grow plants, and that is the first time many of them have seen anything grow. Yeah. They don't even have plants, most of them, in their homes or outside in their yard that they care for. So I'm shocked because I grew up with things growing and I grew up in Mississippi. So I had a big open field and you saw things grow and you could get dirty. And these kids never have those experiences. So it's not a question. It's just, yes, I am interested in this and I try to do something to change their perspective. If I could do more, I would like to know how to do that.
Yeah, congratulations for doing that. That is so important. A lot of, we're an urban nation. Most people in the United States live in cities now. We need to stop thinking it was a big rural. We have large amounts of rural spaces in the United States, but the majority of our population lives in cities. We don't have adequate, sometimes adequate access to nature. We don't want people just growing right on the ground in many places across the United States because of the amount of lead in the soil that's there. You should be growing in a raised bed, as you know. And so a lot of parents were told not to plant something, don't eat something that's off the ground unless it's in a raised bed, and be careful about that. I have to tell you, Teresa, one of the things I did, I taught as part of a grant, some science classes in Yonkers Public School. And I did that. I took the little cup and I had them put the little seed in and then have them water and everything good stuff. These were seniors in high school. And then they saw the little seed come up. And I got more interesting questions than I've ever got in my life about how plants grow because of that. And it's good that we do that. We need nature. We're a species that does best connected to nature. And when we disconnect ourselves from that is when we see many of these problems. In fact, they found that if they just get kids in nature for a few hours, minutes a day, they perform better in school. Their anxiety levels go up. There's less. If you look at cities where there's more urban greenery, there's less crime on the streets. There are all these things that show about the power of nature. There at the hospital, the big one across George Washington Bridge, Presbyterian, wherever it is, they started piping bird song into hospital recovery rooms, fake bird song, just recorded, bird song, because they found that if people could hear birds chirping in the morning, they would heal faster than those that didn't. And the people whose bedrooms faced the Hudson River healed faster than those on the other side who just looked at the city. We need nature, and we've cut our kids off from this. They've cut themselves off, by a distance of only this long, and that's as far as they can get into nature, or they can see this about in nature. And unfortunately, we're paying a price for that, and we need to turn that around. So congratulations for your work. Just keep doing it.
Thank you. I actually, many of you know that I work in an elementary school, and I work with severely and profoundly impaired children. And sometimes we grow the little grass seeds because they're the quickest growing, or bean seeds because you can see the whole thing happening. And I have to say, I am as excited as they are when I see them popping out of the dirt. So keep bringing it on. We have another question. Diane Kozarski, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. This is a tiny question, but is it possible to plant anything on top of polluted soils like lead and cadmium, and maybe in a generation, the trees or those plants will have sucked that stuff out of the soil and you can start using it again?
Yes.
And then you'd have some trees in the meantime, and can you do that?
That's a whole field of study called phytoremediation, Diane, and actually people do those things. What we don't want is people eating those plants. So when we are making recommendations for what people can plant in garden boxes, for example, we give them lists of plants so that we know the roots are very shallow. You don't want youth eating corn, for example, grown in the area if it's grown right on the ground, because it's being exposed to lead in the soil and some other things. Many plants, just like humans, they need minerals and they need metalloids like we do, like zinc and manganese and some other things. And so they will bioaccumulate those things. The problem is that other things like lead and arsenic and cadmium can mimic those metals in a certain extent, in accumulating in plants, and so they can become extremely toxic. The best thing that we can do is plant mushrooms and mycelium. Mycelium can actually go through and break up some of the chemical bonds that we have in our soils and make it much more healthier. Now, there's always been arsenic in our soils. There's arsenic in your soil right there below where you live. There's cadmium. There's other kinds of toxic metals. There's radon. There's all these things, but they're not in the concentrations that we have them. And so that's why we have to do these things. So there is a whole field of people who can grow specialized plants who can suck up these things, but then those things have to be transported to safe fill landfills so that those metals get contained there and get covered over. So yeah, that's a whole field. I'd love to do some of that around the Ethical Society.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see no other hands, so I once again want to thank you for this provocative and illuminating and personal talk. Thank you very much, Curt. I'd also like to thank you, our members and visitors, for joining us this morning. If you'd like to know about a little bit more about who we are and what we do, here's a very short video.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ethicalfocus.org, and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.